Okay, the last piece of information we need to talk about is the progressive era. And the progressive era, or progressivism, is basically a collection of causes that all came together around fixing the country or making progress. And it's really in response to the Industrial Revolution. So we see that business change, work life change, people move into the cities to work in the factories, they're working long hours, unions are starting to form. And we had this group of people that say, okay, this isn't progress, this isn't good enough, people aren't being protected, people aren't being taken care of, this isn't right, and they try and create change. Basically, a progressive movement somewhere around 1890 to World War II. So we're going to say 1890 to 1915, give or take a few years, but roughly the end of the 1800s to the first part of the 1900s. So we see this start at the local level and move forward to the national level, and eventually we have a president that's considered a progressive president. So we're going to run through this real quick. You need to be writing down notes, you need to be taking notes, pay attention so that you can remember kind of the big picture, the detail, and some of the smaller details about this. So progressivism was a series of reforms. They wanted to improve society. It wasn't one group of people. It wasn't one set of reforms. It was a whole bunch of ideas all around the idea that something was wrong with society and they wanted to fix it. So we're going to get a whole bunch of different organizations, everything from the social gospel movement, which the idea was to make things more ethical, settlement houses to provide places for the poor to go, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WTCU, which was supported prohibition as a way to end spousal abuse, drunken husbands beat their wives, that sort of scenario, and as a way to end corrupt politicians, because a lot of politicians that they didn't like would operate out of bars. We see Salvation Armies, libraries, swimming pools, classes, soup kitchens, child care, help for the poor, focus on education, really anything you can do to try and make society better. And we'll talk about what they came up with at the end. But if you were to put them all together and kind of take the movement as a whole, you would see four main goals. And those would be to protect social welfare, protect morals, create economic reform, and foster efficiency. And so remember, they're talking about reforming what they see as wrong in society. And this was the time we talked about with the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, which meant for that average person living in a city, they had lots of hours, really bad place to live. People were crowded together, unsanitary conditions. They weren't getting educated. And in a lot of ways, morals, traditional morals, were kind of going out the window because people in those conditions weren't exactly doing what the previous generations had done before them. So one of the things that most of the progressive people, maybe not all of them, but most of them believed in was the idea that we could use science and scientific theory specifically to make the world a better place. So they believed in doing things that were logical, not just because we'd always done them. And that was a little bit of a shift away from some things that they'd done before, but they really wanted to try and figure out, okay, how can we experiment with things, make it better, use the scientific method. And that actually comes out of a manufacturing process that we see with Henry Ford. So scientific management was known as the way to break things down into small parts, to make it efficient, and Henry Ford used that. It's also known as Taylorism, after the guy that came up with it. But Henry Ford used that with the assembly line. And we see that in Michigan. That's where the middle class comes from in Michigan with all the auto jobs. Henry Ford also was a very complicated guy. I wouldn't necessarily call him a progressive in every way because he was racist and he had some other issues with unions and things. But he was smart enough to create weekends. He wanted people to be able to work and make enough money so that they could drive the cars, they could buy the cars they produce. And there's similar goals to what the progressive movement wanted as far as people being treated fairly. How do we make things better? How do we make things more efficient? So we're going to skip over the videos and we're going to go through a few of the progressive activists. One of the big things about the progressive movement is it has a lot to do with women and women in public life. One of the big things we'll talk about in a second is suffrage, or the right to vote. That was huge during this time period, during the progressive movement. But what we see is upper class white women typically didn't work. Poor white women typically worked in factories, or shops. Very specific jobs. Male and female jobs didn't tend to overlap. They were very segregated, but women did things. So we're going to go through kind of the women's part of the movement first. Women worked in farms in the western part of the countries, and they also worked as domestic servants. But that was kind of sort of it. So what we see is during the time of the progressive movement, we see a series of women's colleges opening up. So we're going to see things like an educated class of women starting to form, upper class women starting to get the education. And what they end up doing is they start to try these reform movements, which is part of the progressive movement. So we see them starting to form things like nurseries, kindergartens, trying to take care of children, trying to solve the problems that women face. So some of the famous women reformers that we look at, people like Florence Kelley, her big thing was she wanted to figure out how do we improve the lives of women and children, because if you're not educated and you either can only get a low-paying job, or you're stuck at home with an abusive husband, or you're stuck at home with a bunch of kids, women wanted something better than that. So she worked in 1893, and she helped to get the Illinois Factory Act passed, which meant that government could go in and make sure that factories were providing safe environments for their workers. And so that doesn't just affect women, it affects women and men, but what she was really looking at is the lowest of paid factory workers tended to be women, and they tended to work in the worst conditions. Some of the famous examples that we would talk about would be things like there's a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York, and the women were actually locked into their jobs because they were afraid a union person would come. So the doors are locked from the outside. There's a fire. The upper floor, a bunch of women are working, and they are mostly all burned to death, or they had to jump to their death because there was no way to get them out because the doors were locked. And so she starts to try and fix what she sees wrong with the factory system. Another one is Carrie Nation. And her thing was all about prohibition. So she was known for walking directly into a saloon and using a hatchet to destroy bottles. So she was kind of a, in-your-face sort of a person. But part of the progressive movement is prohibition. And that's a movement to ban alcohol. And supporters are worried that alcohol was undermining American morals. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or Women's Christian Temperance Movement, was the largest prohibition movement. And as we know, they do eventually get prohibition, which causes a whole nother series of problems. So you got to remember, we're kind of back before the Roaring '20s, we're back before World War I. So those problems are things that we'll talk a little bit more about later. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton, they are trying to get suffrage, which is the right to vote. They founded the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Women went about trying to get the right to vote in lots of different ways, but we're going to see one of the biggest catalysts in them getting suffrage is their role in World War I. When the men leave to fight, the women take the jobs, and that really helps sort of cement their place as contributing members to society versus what they were before, which was not allowed to contribute. So Carrie Catt, another woman suffragist who led the movement after Anthony and Stanton. She was in charge of this during Wilson's first term as president, which is important because that's when we're going to see the big changes at the national level. So 5 tactics of the suffrage movement. First of all, they're very organized. And they had lots of close ties between their different levels. So local, state, national all worked together. They tried to establish a wide base of support. They did that primarily through religious groups and through networking with other women. They were cautious about their lobbying. They didn't go out and get in everyone's face. When they protested, they didn't cause trouble. They protested gracefully. And they tried to do this in a dignified way. They didn't go out and break things or throw things. But they did eventually accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. So the next group of progressives after the women's movement that we're going to talk about here briefly is the journalists. And these guys get called muckrakers because they were the people that exposed what was going on in business and public life. So for a lot of people that weren't living in the slums or weren't working in the factories, for the upper or middle class, they didn't know necessarily what was going on. So these guys were getting the mud or the muck or the yucky stuff, and they were raking it up so people could see it. And that's where the name muckraker came. So they exposed what was wrong with society. So these are some pretty famous names that did some pretty important things. So Ida Tarbell, she exposed what Standard Oil was doing. So if we remember, Rockefeller pretty much puts everybody out of business. She basically follows them around and says what they're doing and makes him look bad. Upton Sinclair, if you've ever read The Jungle or heard of The Jungle, he wrote a book about the meatpacking industry and how bad things were. Famous book. If you look at the text of this, this kind of tells you what life was like in the meatpacking industry. Not a good picture in any way, shape, or form. There's actually examples of, people losing fingers, toes into the meat, and that the plant not stopping, or as bad as people falling into vats of acid in the people and the plant not stopping. As bad as things were today, if you look into the meatpacking industry, they probably were worse back then. So his book about the meatpacking industry almost directly leads to regulation of the food industry. And so it was a big deal, and it's a big deal as far as safety still goes today. We also see a group of socialists, and this is interesting because socialists for a while are pretty popular, and we would probably call socialists communists today. And during this time, during the progressive movement, it was okay in some ways to advocate that that we should have a redistribution of wealth, that the government should take money from rich people and give it to poor people. Some countries have socialism today. Most countries don't. Socialism really is how do you take and make sure everybody has an equal amount. On the surface, it sounds good. Socialists end up kind of losing favor because of what happens in Russia. And we talked the other day with World War I about how Vladimir Lenin comes to power in Russia. The U.S. is afraid of communism. That kind of puts an end to socialists in the United States because we are scared that it's going to take over and it all of a sudden becomes a really bad thing. But for a while, it becomes part of the progressive movement. So Eugene Debs was a leading socialist, part of the Socialist Party. And the socialists and the union parties and the unions kind of worked together because it was all about redistribution of wealth. It was all about taking care of people. And Debs was actually a very strong, powerful union leader. He eventually falls out of favor and basically gets thrown in jail for some things. But he's one of those important people that make a difference in the lives of factory workers and how strong unions are in our country. So at the state level, progressives tried to sort of weaken the influence of big business over government. Others push for child labor laws and a limit on factory workers, but the idea is they're trying to move past the problems they see. So in factories, kids could work in factories unlimited amount of time. Okay, well, we're going to fix that. We're going to make a law that says that. People are working 80 or 90 or 100 hours a week and not getting paid very much. We're going to limit how many hours you can get paid before you have to get extra, or how many hours you can work total. We see that guys like Rockefeller and Carnegie are pretty much buying officials, so how can we fix that? And these are all different things. One of the big guys in the progressive movement, as far as at the state level, was La Follette. Fighting Bob La Follette, or Robert La Follette, was 3-term governor of Wisconsin, fiery, passionate public speaker, and he stops the railroad companies from pressuring leaders to make laws to help their business. So he basically takes on the railroad companies, who are very powerful. As we know, Cornelius Vanderbilt, if you remember the cartoon with him kind of controlling all the railroad companies. In Wisconsin, La Follette takes those on. He's kind of a leader of the progressive movement. The other kind of big picture thing that we see is, how do we reform elections? How do we fix it so that these guys can't pay for people to get elected? If you kind of remember your history a little bit, you know that senators at the state level and at the national level oftentimes were just picked by the governor. And so what that meant is that you could essentially buy a senator. If you paid the governor enough money, he could just pick someone, or the House in the state could pick someone. So what we come up with is these three different things that private citizens come up with to fix elections or reform elections. Okay, they want them to be more fair. They want them to be something that you can't buy. They want to be something that the people's voice is actually heard. And then what they're trying to do again is make progress to create a better future. So first one's initiative, which means that people or a bill can actually be initiated by people, not the lawmakers. So we see ballot initiatives today in Michigan, quite a few of them, anywhere from medical marijuana. You get enough signatures, you can put it on the vote, to canceling the wolf hunt, to just about everything in between. We see a referendum, which is okay. So we have a bill originated by the people. It's a vote to see if people want that. You don't take a bill originated by the people and take it to the legislator and say vote on this. You take it to the people and vote on that, and it's called a referendum. We also see for the first time recalls, which allow people to take politicians out of office if enough signatures are collected. And we see recalls at the local level, state level, fairly common in Michigan. Usually they don't succeed, but sometimes they do. If you read the local papers, you'll see that the smaller the unit of government, the more common recalls are, because one person can get upset and get enough signatures. Right now there's a lot of recalls going on in Gaines Township, for those of you guys that live out there, because one guy doesn't like 2 or 3 of the city council members, and you may have heard of that. So those are all important things in trying to make it so that people's votes count and people's votes are fair, which was one of the issues that the progressive movement or the progressives saw in government with the rise of the industrialists, with guys like Carnegie and Rockefeller. So presidential accomplishments. So as a progressive movement grows, they eventually sort of get this voice in Washington, D.C. And we talked a little bit about Teddy Roosevelt and the idea. His plan, or what he did, he was really the first progressive president, or first one to try and get progressive ideals passed. So his background: governor of New York. He fought in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. He was McKinley's vice president. After McKinley was shot, Roosevelt takes the presidency. He was a great speaker, an impressive athlete, and we talked about the teddy bear story a little bit earlier in the year, but kind of like one of those captivating guys that everybody was interested in. So some of his progressive accomplishments: he advanced civil rights in a general term. He didn't support civil rights on an individual level. He was one of the first presidents to invite a black leader in Booker T. Washington to the White House, which got criticism from other black leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, who thought Booker T. Washington was a sellout. But he does make some progress. So it's not great progress. It's not as much as we're going to see after World War II, but he's better than what it was before. Now, in other areas like the environment, he did make a lot of progress. He was an avid hunter, like we talked about before. So he's one of the first conservationists. He sets up the national park system, creates Yosemite National Park in 1903. He creates U.S. Forest Service to protect those. So he does a lot with hunting and in nature and keeping things pristine, probably more so than anybody before or possibly anybody after. As far as the economy goes, here's what he does. He tries to deal with the railroads. Okay, so they passed the Interstate Commerce Act, and this is touching on some of the things we talked about before. It was supposed to stop the railroad from overcharging, but it was never enforced, so that didn't work. He passed another act called the Elkin Act that made the railroad sort of, illegal for them to charge different things. They had to notify the public, so it was another way of regulating what was going on. He also helped pass the Hepburn Act, which made free passes as bribery illegal. So he basically is kind of one of those guys where it's like, if it doesn't work, I'll try this. If that doesn't work, I'll try this. I'm going to fix the problem any way that I can. One of his famous things was the coal miner strike. Coal miners went on strike because they wanted 9-hour work days and a 20% raise, and they wanted the right to unionize. When the miners said, to heck with you, we're not doing that, the strike went on for at least 5 months. And the problem was, if the miners didn't work, people were going to freeze to death because they needed coal to heat their houses. So Roosevelt brought both sides to the White House, and he sort of settled it. Now, the thing is, this is kind of against the progressive movement in some ways because they wanted the workers to have more power. He said, no, though, if a strike threatened the public good, the federal government should intervene, and he intervened with troops. So in this way, he's kind of conflicted as a progressive. He doesn't have always the most perfect record, but he overall is remembered as a progressive. Food safety, we talked about the jungle with Upton Sinclair. The direct result of that is the Meat Inspection Act, which dictated strict cleanliness codes, and the Food and Drug Act, which stops tainted foods and drugs from making it into the marketplace, and it required truthful labeling. So things that we still use today are results of the progressive movement. So real quick with other presidential politics, 1908, Roosevelt had served almost 2 full terms because he technically could have served another term, but he had promised not to. Back then there was no law on how many terms. So William Howard Taft runs for president and he wins. William Jennings Bryan's run for a 3rd time is a Democratic guy, and he was another progressive, and he lost. So what we see is William Taft actually get more done, and we talked about this before. 90 trusts are busted in his 4-year term, which is more than Roosevelt. But Taft doesn't have sort of the public, opinion that he does, or that Roosevelt did. So Taft is sort of not looked upon that highly. Roosevelt's upset with him. The tariff acts, they try and compromise on lower tariffs to please the progressives. The progressives wanted free trade. They wanted things to be better than what they were. But the progressives actually got angry because the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act actually didn't do what it was supposed to, and it backfired and create higher taxes. So Taft is also controversial because he doesn't protect conservation land, which was one of the things that Roosevelt cared a lot about. So basically what ends up happening is by 1912, Roosevelt is upset. And so we see in the election of 1912, Roosevelt actually creates his own party called the Bull Moose Party and tries to run. The problem is the Republicans and the Progressives, or the Bull Moose Party, were essentially would have all voted for the same person if they only had one choice. So he splits the Republican vote, which means that Wilson is going to win, which he probably wouldn't have otherwise. So Roosevelt, being the stubborn guy he is, runs for a 3rd term and splits the whole Republican vote. Can't kick Taft out because he's a sitting president, so it ends up causing a mess with the Bull Moose Party. And that name came because Roosevelt was strong as a bull moose, kind of his personality is he's up and in everybody's face. But Wilson wins with actually a really small percentage of the election. So he actually is not that popular, but he wins the thing. Now the thing with Wilson is he actually is a progressive, and he actually still gets things done. So he does things like antitrust laws, banking reforms, and reduces tariffs. So even though the Progressive Party doesn't win, they still kind of win because the progressive movement still sort of happens from the presidential thing. So background on Wilson: religious family, lawyer, history professor, president of Princeton. He's a very smart guy. He'd been governor in New Jersey. He was the first president to talk to Congress all at one time in person. So first one to give the State of the Union address in person. He comes up with a new tax system. So he reduces tariffs for the first time since the Civil War. He started a graduated income tax. So under Wilson's the first time that we actually have income taxes based on income. People who make smaller salaries pay less money. First income tax scale was between 1% and 6%. He also comes up with some more antitrust legislation. The Federal Trade Commission started in 1914 to investigate unfair business practices, and the Clayton Antitrust Act stopped one company from getting stock in another if it would create a monopoly. Other thing he creates in 1913 that we already talked about before is a Federal Reserve System, and it was young and didn't have a lot of power, and as we talked about with the Great Depression, but banks under the control of the federal government would still be privately owned and operated, but the Federal Reserve System could issue money in an emergency and give loans. So he sets up the system that ends up saving us out of the Great Depression. So Outcomes from the progressive movement, pretty significant things here. 16th Amendment, 1913, income tax amendment. 17th Amendment, people could vote for their state senators. And these are amendments to the Constitution which are extremely difficult to pass. They don't happen real often, so these are big things. 18th Amendment, 1919, prohibition. And 19th Amendment, after World War I, women get the right to vote based on their contributions to the war effort. So pretty big deal as far as what the progressive movement gets done. So you guys need to be able to kind of understand what was the progressive movement and what were the sort of big picture outcomes of that. Make sure you have your notes in your Google Drive so that I can give you some points for them.